in Georgia, which we could get into in the Q&A period, and also have failed to make significant gains at regaining our state level governments, which are still largely in the hands of Republicans. And not only that, right now, if you go on pretty much any media outlet, the people that they say to blame for this are the left and those bad socialists who cost them the election, supposedly. So tonight we're going to discuss what the results of the election mean for the socialist left, as well as how we can continue to push a political agenda forward that favors working people rather than the elite. So first, our panelists are going to give introductory remarks, and then we're going to explore a number of different issues around this election during a moderated Q&A. So if you have questions for any of our panelists, please type them in the chat. There's a lot of people on this call, probably a lot of questions, so we're going to do our best to get to as many questions as possible. So I want to introduce the panelists. First, we have Ben Burgis, the author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, host of the Give Them an Argument podcast and regular Jacobin contributor. Mark Dudzic, the national coordinator of the Labor Campaign for Single Payer. Paul Prescod, a member of the Philadelphia Federation of Teachers and Philly DSA Labor Commission co-chair. And Olivia Harding, Philly DSA at-large steering committee member. So to kick things off, Ben, do you want to get us started?
Sure. You know, I think that the way that I'd like to think about this is that it's the second worst possible thing that could have happened, but also that there's a gap between the worst thing and the second worst possible thing that could have happened that should matter to us. Paul wrote an article for Jacobin about Trump's National Labor Relations Board, which I've copied and pasted so many times to link it to leftists I was arguing about with the election online, that I think if you start to type in Jacobin Meg on my browser, it'll go author Paul Prescott, because like I constantly did that to pull up his article. And I think it's a really important point, right? Because we should be able to acknowledge two things, which are that Trump and Biden are both enemies of the working class, and they're different kinds of enemies, and the difference between them should make a tactical and strategic difference to us, that they represent very different strategies for managing the system on behalf of capital. And the Republican strategy really involves trying to stamp out what's left of collective bargaining in the United States in a much more aggressive way than anything that would happen under Biden, which we know because we can compare the Obama era NLRB rulings with the Trump era NLRB rulings. And that's not, but then the flip side of that is that a lot of people who are aligned with the left, broadly speaking, which let's just roughly say people who voted for Bernie, I think are probably way too credulous right now about thinking that everything that's on the Biden-Harris campaign website is actually going to happen, or even would happen if there were Democratic Senate, which it looks like there probably won't be. And that's obviously also wrong, and I think it's important that we acknowledge that and not give any kind of honeymoon to Biden or any kind of credit for thinking, oh, that he's not perfect, but or he's flawed, but no, I mean this is a person who basically doesn't stand for the things that that are important to us, who very much stands opposed to them. He said, when the pandemic was already going on, he said he would veto Medicare for all. I think we should take that seriously. So what all of that means for left strategy going forward is a lot trickier to say. I think that unfortunately, as much as I hate to say this, I think that we need to be thinking probably smaller than we've gotten used to thinking in terms of electoral politics, in terms of victories that can take place on the state level or even on the local level. Anyway, I'm sure we'll get much more into that. So somebody else go.
All right, thanks, Ben. Mark, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Melissa. And I'm going to talk mostly about labor and Medicare for all. But first, I just want to say it's great to be with a bunch of folks from Philadelphia. It was really fun watching the kind of organizing and activism that was happening around election week. And I don't know if your city was the one with the dancing post office boxes, but that was truly awesome. And, I think watching kind of the joy that activists were organizing in Philly just was a real morale booster. That was last week. As Ben said, now we're faced with Joe Biden. He's no FDR and he's no LBJ, although there was some article in the Times wishfully thinking that. And I'll make a bold prediction. Bernie Sanders is not going to be the Secretary of Labor in the Biden administration. And Randy Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, is not going to be the Secretary of Education, and so on and so forth. Biden, as we've all know, is a representative of the neoliberal Democratic establishment, and quite frankly, they kicked our ass during the primary season. We lost a harsh ideological struggle for the future direction of the Democratic Party, and we lost it. We fought a good fight, and we retreated with a lot of our forces intact. But we lost that fight, and they have been pretty clear all along about what their real program is. So that's sort of what we have to anticipate. And I just think spending my life in the labor movement, it's really ironic. It's the AFL-CIO has been around for 65 years through all kinds of horrific circumstances. And this is really the first time that I heard a serious discussion about the possibility of a general strike in response to an attempt to steal this election. And, it's kind of ironic that it, would have revolved around the demand of installing a neoliberal anti-working class administration into Democratic office. But you take what you can take, I guess. I also want to say that, Medicare for All, I think, has really become the wedge issue in these kind of struggles, both the political struggle for, working class politics, either within or outside of the Democratic Party, and, within the labor movement, sort of the direction of where we need to be going as a labor movement. Do we circle the wagons around trying to preserve this dying employment-based healthcare system, or do we, speak on behalf of the entire working class and fight for making a healthcare a birthright of everyone in America? So this has become the wedge issue, and out of that issue, once you move out of the tip of that wedge, it opens up the possibility for talking about a whole lot of other issues regarding working class issues, concerns, and the public good. So we're sort of at the tip of that wedge. And, with all of that said, regardless of what the Biden administration wants to do or thinks it wants to do, and regardless of who controls the Senate, the healthcare crisis is real, it's ongoing, it affects almost every working class household in this country, and it's not going away. It's been intensified by the COVID depression, and it will drive the political agenda over the next several years. And we as socialists and working class advocates need to get in front of that issue and provide real leadership on Medicare for All as a solution, and a real understanding of how we win that fight by going through the amassed corporate power that constitutes the medical industrial complex and their political allies. So, this is, when you look at where the labor movement is right now on this key wedge issue, first of all, there is a significant section of the labor movement that has been pretty much all in on Medicare for All. It's not an insignificant section, even looking at the national sections of the labor movement. There's about 12 national unions that have been pretty consistent in their support. There's a coalition of national unions. The AFL-CIO does a sets up these subcommittees to make transition recommendations to the incoming administrations. And there was a fairly significant block of single payer Medicare for all unions that were advocating a much more expansive, transformative program to be presented to the Biden administration. So there's a significant section of the labor movement that's in on Medicare for all and is, continues to be in their commitment. And then there's there's another section of the labor movement that sort of has vested interest in the status quo. And those are unions, some unions that have built their unions around health and welfare funds that provide benefits to people, and that those unions, those funds have become sort of the reason for existence for those unions. That's kind of there's not as many unions out there like that as there were a decade ago or 20 years ago. And many of those funds are in crisis, and they need to think of a way out in an exit strategy. So that's a diminishing section. And related to that section is some unions that are basically just ideologically opposed to Medicare for all and other kind of public goods kind of organizing. Firefighters have been leading, sort of an ideological battle within labor against Medicare for all. Some very significant elements in the Teamsters union, have a very backward look on, anything that smacks of socialism. And, there's a few other unions out there that have this ideological issue that, needs to be dealt with. But then the predominant view of the unions that have not stood up for Medicare for all is basically driven by the concern that they don't want to disrupt their instrumental relationships with the Democratic Party. And it's not based on any sort of institutional or ideological objections to Medicare for all. It's based on the fact that, we want the Biden administration to take a stand against school privatization. So we better kiss his ass on his healthcare policy. We don't want to get off message. And those kind of very instrumental relationships. I'll point out that a little over a year ago in 2019, a majority of unions, because of the political dynamics at that moment, had endorsed Medicare for all for the first time since the early 1990s. And then they immediately began to backtrack. But I know that, like, when Bernie was surging this past winter, a number of unions that had not been in the Medicare for all fight were conducting internal focus groups about how to talk to their members about Medicare for all in the event that they had to support Bernie in the general election. So those instrumental relationships are driving the labor movement, which means that there's huge opportunities to move those institutions into this fight, because those are just sort of transactional relationships, and those transactions change all the time, and you're likely to be enmeshed in the administration that is going to instinctively want to try to compromise with the Republican majority in the Senate, and will be under huge pressure to embrace austerity politics from the beginning. So there's huge opportunities there. And in addition to that, there's, labor is facing an internal reckoning that is going to begin to play out in the post-election period. Labor is in crisis, it's stagnating, and there's some debates about the future of labor. The Teamsters Union will have a national election this year, and it's very likely possible, I don't want to say likely, but very possible that a reform slate will beat the slate that's been backed by the Hoffa forces. And this reform slate, is not going to sing the Internationale when they get inducted into office, but they could very well kind of shake up the labor movement. And I point out that the last brief moment of insurgency in the labor movement was sort of sparked by an election in the Teamsters Union that put a guy named Ron Kerry into the presidency for several years. So there you have that dynamic. And then this fall, there will be a AFL-CIO convention. It's every 4 years. It's likely that there will be a fight for the leadership of the AFL-CIO. It's not definite, but Richard Trumka has probably going to retire. And the leading candidate for the future of the labor is Sarah Nelson, the leader of the flight attendants, AFA CWA affiliate. And Sarah Nelson could very well sing the Internationale at her inauguration. She is, represents, a much more independent, progressive wing in the labor movement, and with a pretty coherent criticism about where we need to go. So those dynamics are playing out in labor, and we should really think about the possibilities there. And the other thing I just wanted to mention very quickly is that folks in Philly, many on this call or on this Zoom meeting, have kind of built a very kind of a model of how to organize a grassroots labor-based initiative. They've helped pull together a group of over 30 Philadelphia area unions who are working to get Representatives Evans, Dean, and Scanlon to co-sponsor the Healthcare Emergency Guarantee Act. They've done really effective work pulling together these unions, and that's the kind of labor models I think that we need to go to take advantage of these opportunities going forward. And I took way too long. I apologize.
No, don't apologize. That was great. And I want to dig a lot more into the dynamics between Medicare for All and how unions orient around progressive demands in the Q&A. But for now, I'm going to shift it to Paul.
All right. Thanks again, everyone who put this together. And Ben, you might have to be my press agent. Thank you for promoting my work so much, apparently. So I'm going to spend actually most of my time talking about how we can work with the elected officials we already have in the future. But first, I'll say some brief words about how we can look at increasing our electoral power and becoming more of a force in electoral politics. So there's so much that could be said and so many hot takes to be had about the election. And so this is not any kind of comprehensive assessment. But I think when we look at the resilience of support for Trump, despite everything that's happened, I think part of the explanation here, and not all of it, but part of the explanation is that a lot of people still feel that he's the only person speaking to them, the only person that is acknowledging what working people are going through, that is cutting through the bullshit and fighting for them and not looking down their nose at them. And I think one of the missing pieces in the electoral success of the left recently is that we still aren't getting many candidates that really come from the labor movement, that know that world and can speak that language and can have a working class base from the beginning of their candidacy. So we should be looking to run more candidates that really represent that. And I think we should focus on, and I agree with what Ben was saying at the beginning of thinking a little bit smaller, but not that much smaller, focus on state level and congressional races. Because I think at these levels, you can actually campaign on and eventually implement the more bold, transformative policies that we want. And at the same time, we shouldn't feel that we need to run for every seat that comes up. Like, we're not going to gain a majority in Congress overnight. So I think we should be a little selective about investing in electoral politics in races where we know we have a very strong candidate that represents an actual movement and social base. So in the last 4 or 5 years, the social democratic left has had more success in the realm of electoral politics than in the realm of the labor or social movements. And so, of course, on its own, electoral politics will not be enough without a real movement behind it rooted in labor. But we should be thinking about how our approach to electoral politics is different. What are we trying to achieve that is different than any other regular Democrat running for office? So the most obvious point of why electoral politics is important is that you simply need the votes to pass reforms that we want. But I think there's something else we're trying to do, and that's figure out how our elected officials can govern or legislate in a way that actively and practically helps working people organize, helps build political support for various movements and campaigns, and provides political education on a deeper level. And I know that may sound a little like vague and starry-eyed, so I'm going to propose some specific examples of what I'm talking about. I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds on local examples, so I apologize to people who are not in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, but I think this stuff could apply anywhere. So I'll start by talking about how we can work with elected officials to support the labor movement. And I'm taking a lot of inspiration here from what Bernie Sanders has done in his career as an elected official in Vermont. And so this is not just nostalgia for the Bernie campaign. There is a real reason I want to talk about him. So here are some things he did to offer concrete solidarity and assistance to the labor movement. So he would convene annual meetings of local labor activists to help them develop more successful organizing and bargaining strategies in both the private and public sector. He would invite high-profile labor leaders from out of the state to speak at these events. In 1994, he sent a letter to a phone company customer service reps in Vermont who were considering joining the Communication Workers of America. He urged them in this letter to vote yes, and the majority of them did vote yes to join the union. In 2006, Verizon had threatened to sell its landline operations in New England, which would have basically destroyed the contracts that CWA and IBEW members had. So Bernie convened a public forum in Burlington where workers, consumers, and other industry experts spoke out against this pending sale. He brokered a meeting between IBEW and CWA and top executives at Fairpoint, and workers said that it was because of the pressure of Sanders being in the room that Fairpoint remained neutral when these two unions organized their non-union workers in New England. So reading about this stuff really inspired me and kind of fired up my imagination. So let's get specific and talk about how we could apply this approach in Philadelphia and other parts of the state. And again, I think this applies to any city or state in this country. And a lot of this is based on the premise that elected officials have a broader base and a much wider audience than we have. So they can play a role in amplifying and rallying behind different fights. And our chapter in Philly has developed some great working relationships with local unions, as Mark alluded to. And we have a few electeds in the state legislature that are allies. So I think we're ready to actually put some of this into action in the next year or two. So we have the union PASNAP, which organizes nurses and other health professionals in PA. And I think they've been one of the most successful unions in organizing new workers in our area. In 2016, they organized 4 hospitals in the Philadelphia area. Since then, they've added a few more that are out in what is called Trump country. They've organized unions there as well. So, our left elected officials, they can hold public forums about the issue of safe nurse to patient ratios, which is one of their priorities, and why that's so important for patients and the community as a whole. When new hospitals are getting organized, electeds can write letters to workers encouraging them to join the union. This union also does open bargaining, which means basically the community can come to bargaining sessions. So during contract fights, elected officials can hold public events about what the contract is about. Group of elected officials can write letters to the hospitals pressuring them to settle a fair contract. We also work with Teamsters Local 623, which represents UPS workers in Philadelphia. Their contract is up in a little under 2 years, I think, and we know this is going to be a bitter fight. So what if our allied elected officials convened a broad meeting of unions and community organizations to strategize on how we can support the union in this fight against UPS? Maybe even bring in a high-profile name like Sarah Nelson, to offer solidarity and build morale. Many unions are facing a severe pension crisis, so we should work with legislators to come up with a very concrete plan to save these pensions. We learned through our work a few years ago is that one of the priorities for United Fruit and Commercial Workers is creating state-run unionized marijuana dispensaries. And if you look in the presidential election, many ballot measures around legalizing marijuana passed. So maybe we can look at a ballot measure down the road and make sure that we're creating dispensaries that are, unionized workers who are working in those dispensaries. We've already locally began to hold meetings with leaders from the building trades about a plan for green renovation of our public school buildings, which would create thousands of high quality union jobs throughout the state. So our left electeds should be part of the process of drafting a policy paper on this and holding public forums that educate people how Green New Deal policies like this will actually create quality jobs. And so all of these are examples of ways our elected officials can actively intervene on the side of unions and working people. And what it could also do is start to restore the faith of union members in politics and show them why electoral politics does still matter. If you have an elected official who is actively swaying a fight that you're involved in, I think that's going to go a long way towards increasing you that voting matters, paying attention to politics matters. And so the last thing I want to talk about is the role of elected officials in fighting austerity. And I think this has to be a focal point of our work. We know that in the aftermath of the COVID economic crisis, state and local governments are going to be cutting like crazy. One could argue that we've been living in austerity since the 1980s, but this has been accelerated since the 2008 recession. And just imagine what another round of austerity on top of that is going to do to us. So we have to be all in to fight the cuts. I mean, the motto should just be hold the line against the cuts. So taking a page out of Bernie's book, there's no reason why our electeds can't convene a summit on austerity with the labor movement, especially public sector unions. And in this summit, we can establish a clear analysis of the revenue shortfalls and how we can get revenue through taxing the rich. And this will also be the place to develop the strategy of how we will fight back. In this process, we can galvanize the public against the top corporate villains. Electeds can amplify the message about Comcast not paying taxes, the natural gas industry in Pennsylvania not paying taxes, companies like Amazon, really highlight corporate villains that we're going to go after. And this is something that can unite different parts of the state. And maybe, just maybe, these anti-austerity campaigns can help us start to overcome the urban-rural divide in American politics, which was, I think, totally on display through these election results. And it also gives us an opportunity to work with DSA chapters and elected officials from all parts of the state in a common project. So I think along with helping the labor movement, we need to be very laser focused on fighting austerity in the coming years. So I'll leave it there, but I think these are some ideas about what our elected officials who are already in office can do to help stimulate a broad movement.
Thanks, Paul. I want to bring it to Liv for our final panel, and then we'll get into Q&A.
Hi, everyone. I'm Liv, or Olivia. I am a member of Philly DSA, and I'm on the steering committee as an at-large member. And for this panel, I've been specifically tasked with talking about DSA and Philly DSA's future in this post-Trump world that is still going to feature an impossible Senate and probably still a really maddening House as well. I honestly, Paul, that was so good that I want to build off of a ton of what you said, but I'm sure that we can get back and go to specific points. So I want to start off by acknowledging that, as you guys many have already said, we, as in Bernie, didn't beat Biden in the primary. We failed to have that victory. And I think that we likely could not have beat Biden, as in there wasn't some kind of fluke contingency that, oh, if just this one thing had happened another way, all would have been different. I think that the clearest retrospectives have somewhat of a consensus that primary voters just wanted to beat Trump, and there wasn't a new mass mobilization of new voters that thought they could be able to vote healthcare into office. And I believe that if a majority of people really thought if you could vote for somebody to win good things, Bernie would be the president-elect right now. But the fact is that even in states where a clear majority of voters supported getting rid of private health insurance in favor of a government program, Bernie still didn't win. So we have to fully reckon with that fact that most people, non-voters, every-time voters, Americans basically in this political, whatever, neoliberal, however you want to call it, moment, don't conceive of electoral politics as a battleground to win demands. And honestly, it does make sense, because voting choices in our recent history have not been about materialist choices. They've been about personalities and ideas of party identification and about culture. So the question we're facing is, how do we get a critical mass of people to participate in politics, not because they see themselves as political, but because they see it as a choice of making their lives and their families' lives, people they care about, better. And so that's where my where do we go statement starts by saying that we need long-term and unglorious organizing to build up legitimate institutions that let people see that you can challenge structural inequality and structural injustice that they don't see at this point. And I absolutely do not want to give the impression that endorsing Bernie for DSA and canvassing like hell for him like we did here was a bad idea. it was a great idea. It was a way to jumpstart the beginning of that long-term process. But I will say, I think that we have to let go of this fixation on who is going to be the next Bernie, like who's going to be the progressive challenger for the presidency in 2024. Even to the level, like, who should we endorse for the Senate seat in PA if Pat Toomey is going to leave office? What we should fixate on is how the Bernie campaign organization made some of their most important connections and built their most important parts of their movement. So I'm talking about the way that they organized meatpacking workers in Iowa and taxi drivers and casino workers in Nevada. That's how we should be thinking about building going forward, as in like these foundations of future alignments, not like grasping at straws and gasping like we're fish out of water waiting for our next electoral test. So Paul, like, honestly went into lots of detail and did lots of research about what that could look like. I want to touch on a couple of, maybe I'm just going to phrase these things differently, but a couple of different ways an organization like Philly DSA could begin and continue as well to work on this long-term institution building. So a couple things for the short term, like as the new year starts, thinking about possibly taking on a campaign for one or several issues that would be led at a national level by a national organization, something like a progressive union or a progressive, like a coalition of progressive unions, maybe that have already endorsed Medicare for all, or even by Bernie Sanders, some entity that already has some trust. They have tons of contact information to drive participation, especially like in the early stages. They have institutional connections to other unions, to candidates, progressive and socialist candidates, and other strategic organizations that would be the engine to take on like the issue in the campaign. So for example, maybe that would be lowering the age of Medicare, or something that would support unions, making it easier for them to challenge unfair labor practices. These are things that have been talked about by Bernie and others. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is intentionally turning our attention to the state level. And if you've ever been to one of Philly DSA's policy talks, Jason Leach will probably have told you about how much power has been consolidated by Republicans over a long term at the state house level, how much power they have over money, allocations, and stuff. But now we know we have elected allies there, and we know we want to hold them accountable to what they were elected to do. So I think that this is really attractive to a lot of our members, that we could build with DSA chapters across the state and turn on heat on legislators across center of Pennsylvania all the way out to the west on a single popular campaign, something that centers workers, something we know we could find the majority support for. For example, this could be something like a statewide Fair Workweek Act. For those who aren't in Philly, Fair Workweek was a municipal piece of legislature that was passed in City Hall, and it makes sure that workers know their work hours like a certain time in advance for the next week. There's probably more to it than that, but as a brief summary. And then we would need to follow up with that and make sure that it would be enforced and support the workers who need it. So these are two things that come to my mind. It could be some limited combination of both, but in a strategic way. And then just going forward in general, maybe more if you think about it medium term, taking on strategic electoral campaigns. And like Paul said, the way that we conceive of these is not just anyone who is saying good things, even if we do agree with them. These are strategic because they are, especially in districts that are working class. We're not just mobilizing people we already agree with, but we are building legitimacy, and we're going out and talking to them on issues that they care about. And then along with those limited electoral campaigns, supporting unions as Philly DSA has and should continue to do, pushing for pro-worker policies that have already been mentioned, and also continuing to pressure the unions who don't support those things. I think Mark mentioned the Medicare for All letter that a coalition of unions signed on to help pressure Dwight Evans, Mary Gay Scanlon, and Madeline Dean in the Philly area. And I got to sit in on some of those meetings, and the way that this letter came together, just watching people like be strategic about who do we talk to first, and like who is the power center that it would make sense to get on board. And then you go to the other unions and say, well, this is who we have so far, and like bringing people in that way. And without the work of people in Philly DSA and our labor commission, like I don't know where else like we could carry out that kind of work. So the last thing that I want to say is a broader one that has been inspired by labor organizer Jane McAlevey, who you've probably heard of, and it's about not taking shortcuts. So to me, when I think of shortcutting, I think of superficial, shallow signaling and like flitting from one thing to the next as if like something is just around the corner and this is the last step. But this is not a good idea, because first of all, we will always be out shortcutted as socialists at the present moment. A very quick story, I probably am going long, but I was listening to some reporting about California and Prop 22, the like gig economy, corporate they wanted to consolidate their power over workers, saying that they're not really workers or something. Basically, Uber and Lyft and these gig economy like corporations, they were making up like fake social justice organizations, sending out fake lit. They actually got the NAACP to endorse their Prop 22 in the state. Like, we can't out shortcut that. And number two, because shortcutting, we just know it doesn't work. And the decline into this disillusionment that we're talking about, people dropping out of the electorate, thinking that voting is not for them, it didn't happen overnight, and it's not going to reverse overnight. So we have to commit to strategic priorities, using our labor connections, campaigning on healthcare, and use our small d democratic organization. Right now we're talking about Philly DSA, but wherever you are, where we have dues paying members who vote for and carry out the work and the campaigns that follow. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Liv. Okay, so we're going to move into a moderated Q&A. The Political Education Committee has prepared a couple of questions for our panelists, and then we'll go into audience questions. So I wanted to start off and direct a question to Ben. So I think in the media, it's not been very surprising, but it has been very consistent that the Democrats have consistently been blaming progressives and socialists and our demands that are too radical and too extreme on their poor performances everywhere outside of the presidency. So I wanted to ask, does this response, even though it's, it's not surprising and was forecasted that, the love affair with the Bernie turned Biden voters would turn sour, does this change at all the left's relationship with the Democratic Party and the way in which for the past 4 years, especially, the left has been using the Democratic Party ballot line?
I mean, I don't think so. I think that, it might change how people see that relationship, in the sense that they might have a more realistic view of it now, because they see that even when we really save them, then they're still going to find ways to scapegoat us for their failures, right? So, I mean, if you think about this, talk to Branko Marcetic about this on Sunday, and he, and he put it really well, which is to say that like, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to imagine a world where Bernie Sanders was the nominee and the election happened exactly the same way, that Bernie just barely beat Trump by such a narrow margin that we had to wait for 4 days to hear the results of the election, and he lost Florida, and there were all these down ballot failures that, we know what they would say about that. That there's no doubt whatsoever that they would say that this is really the referendum on the Bernie approach. That shows that it doesn't work, that, voters are rejecting his crazy far left message. And somehow they're still trying to do this, even though the candidate was Joe Biden, who was the most centrist of the centrist candidates in the primary, other than people like John Delaney, who you have to be some kind of weird political obsessive to know who that is, like really have your John Delaney trading card out. Then other than that, Biden was really the only candidate in the primary who wasn't making some effort to at least rhetorically split the difference between the Bernie movement and standard Obama Clinton centrism. He wasn't using any of these phrases like Medicare for all that want it, or any of these rhetorical devices like that to try to make it sound like what he wanted was kind of sort of what Bernie people wanted. He was being relatively honest about the fact that that's not the case. As I mentioned earlier, he said after the pandemic had already started, he would veto Medicare for all. In September, he was bragging, "I beat the socialist." So this is the candidate, and yet still they're trying this stuff, which is it's just bizarre, right? That like people didn't vote for Joe Biden in high enough numbers because they didn't like Bernie Sanders. It's very weird, especially because at least in some swing states. I mean, I know less about what's happened here in Pennsylvania, but certainly in Michigan, where I'm from, I think that a lot of the reason that Biden won Michigan in 2020 when Hillary Clinton lost it in 2016 is because people like Rashida Tlaib, the congresswoman from Detroit, or Abdul El-Sayed, who was the former Bernie candidate for governor, who now has an organization called South Michigan, were actually campaigning much more aggressively in many ways than the Biden campaign was. So having seen that even when they're saved by the left from the near miss of losing, which I think is, obviously the election didn't come out the same way it did in Michigan or anywhere else for just one reason. It came out that way for a lot of reasons, but it's close enough that that's a significant factor. And certainly hardly anybody voted for like Howie Hawkins this time compared to Jill Stein in 2012. Most media outlets weren't even bothering to report the Hawkins numbers in the election results. So I think it is fair to say that after Stein did get more votes than the gap between Clinton and Trump in some states in 2016. Not that that's really, I think, in the top 10 reasons why Hillary Clinton lost. That the left sort of making the calculation, that some of us were urging it to make, really did save Biden, and that after all of that they're still trying to scapegoat the left. If you were under the impression that the Democratic establishment are our friends and we can work it out, then I could see that would be very disillusioning. But of course, I'm sure nobody here was under that impression, and so I think that it's business as usual, right? I mean, obviously, they are going to try to stamp out their left flank in any way that they possibly can, and I think that's just baked in. You just have to take it for granted that they're going to do that, even when it's self-defeating for them. And so then I think the real question is the one that Paul especially was raising earlier, right? About what we do once we realize that there's no amount of helping them beat right-wing Republicans that's going to make centrist Democrats like us. And they're going to do what they're going to do. Biden is not going to govern as Bernie light. Bernie is not going to be the Secretary of Labor. even Elizabeth Warren, who, just for the record, but even Elizabeth Warren is not going to be Secretary of Treasury. That's not happening. So once you realize that, what do you do going forward? And I think that it is mostly just taking what chances that we have, like Liv was saying, like Paul was saying, on the state level, on the congressional level. Abdul Al-Sayed, who I mentioned earlier, I talked to him the other day for a Jacobin article, and one thing he was really emphasizing was thinking about, like, when Canada got Medicare for all, right? It happened at the provincial level in Nova Scotia, Saskatchewan, before it happened on the federal level. And to the, there might be opportunities to have state level public health plans coming up. I know that even that feels like a long shot right now, but I think it's less of a long shot. And then also, I think to kind of tie into something that all of the other panelists touched on to one extent or another, I think that I think the left needs to take union politics much more seriously than it has, and to really understand that left electoral politics might, to a considerable degree, be downstream of union politics. That it is possible that if things had gone just right, and the Democratic establishment had been just as dumb in 2020 as the Republican establishment was in 2016, when they never consolidated around Marco Rubio or whatever, that maybe Bernie could have gone through. But basically, we were weaker than they were, and the lack of an organized working class is a big part of why. And so we really need to buckle in for this sort of long, slow, unsexy work of organizing for left politics in the labor movement, and then in down ballot electoral politics when those opportunities present themselves.
Thanks, Ben. I actually just texted someone today about the need for a long, slow plan. So I'm totally with you on that. I want to pick up on a bunch of different threads that you laid out in your response, and dig a little bit more into what happened during the election and what that kind of, how we should interpret that and move forward. And specifically, I want to look at the people who voted for Trump. And I think there's been a lot of discussion about Trump's rising voter percentage with basically everyone who's not a white man. And in addition, the fact that 40% of union households voted for Trump. So Paul, I want to kick this to you and just ask, what should the left make of these changes in, the GOP electorate? And I think in particular, this is complicated by the fact that the Democrats, as we know, are going to continue to remain hostile to demands that I think we think would ameliorate this, like Medicare for all, better union and labor protections.
Yeah, I mean, I can start first in terms of how Trump doing better with people of color, and kind of the reaction to this that I'm hearing sometimes from the mainstream media, sometimes from parts of the left, definitely not everyone, but some people are kind of doubling down on a certain kind of anti-racist framework and saying, see, we need to focus even more on this because people are being so duped, even people of color. We need more anti-racist trainings, all this kind of thing. And I think that's very wrong. I think we need to stop and think and reckon with these results. The fact is, many people, including many people of color, do not see anti-racism in the terms that a lot of the left does. They don't think of themselves in these same strict categories that some of the left does. And in this election cycle, repeatedly, reality has contradicted certain tropes people keep repeating. We saw how all the candidates had tried to be the most woke and so-called intersectional. And I'm talking about like Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren, but not just them, did the worst among people of color. There was this constant mantra that, Bernie had to be more woke in order to get more support from Black voters. And I always say this in response, and so far no one has had a good answer. And if that is true, what in the hell explains Joe Biden getting the most support among Black voters? And we should also be clear that Bernie, got the second most support, and among 30 and under, he got the most. But has Biden ever had a woke thought in his life, let alone said a woke thing in his life? The answer is no. And that means that there are a lot of other factors that go into why in any given moment, in any given political situation, a majority of Black voters might support a given candidate. So I think the narrative that says, see, racism is even more ingrained than we thought and we need to go harder, I think is dangerous. I think we got lucky that that mindset, didn't tank us this time. But I think if we keep going with these blinders on and ignore certain realities and ignore what might be appealing to people, like we're just going to be let off a cliff. And real quickly, just on the union vote part, those results are frustrating that Trump got so much of the union vote, but still, I don't think not too surprising. I think when you step back and you think about the fact that Democrats still have not delivered anything for working people, are not even rhetorically offering them anything. They didn't even campaign against Trump on the basis of him being a fake populist and talking about his anti-labor record. There's a lot of material there to work with. They didn't bring those issues up. And many unions are kind of hollowed out, and there's probably not a lot of political education going on. So I don't think it's totally surprising. It's very frustrating, but it kind of comes back to these same tasks that we have to try and prove that in another election.
Thanks, Paul. So I want to kind of shift gears a bit and talk about post-election, where we're going, and kind of pick up on, especially Mark, some of your comments about Medicare for all and the promise that holds for the left. And I think most people have mentioned this at this point, but obviously the environment that we are wading into in terms of the alignment of the executive and the legislative and the judicial, which I mean, who even knows what's going to happen with the new Supreme Court. But it's not particularly favorable for passing a bold progressive agenda. And I think that some of the way that the discussion has kind of unfolded about how to relate to national politics right now has looked at, should we pressure Biden and specifically pressure him on things that he can do through executive order, that we can just bypass the legislative branch completely and kind of focus on, immediate gains that we could get through the executive. And some of the things that have been touted in this regard are canceling student debt, allowing postal banking, increasing the level and degree of prosecution of labor rights violations. So I'm wondering kind of what you think of that approach of focusing on, what's technically winnable at the national level versus continuing to push demands that do require legislation, but that we know are not going to happen under a Biden administration.
Well, I would say that in general, if we follow that approach, we will be weaker 4 years from now than we are today. And that is in fact sort of the approach that labor and a lot of other progressive movements have been following since somewhere around 1976 or 1980. It's, let's circle the wagons, let's get what we can do. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So, yes, of course, we got to demand that Biden do whatever he can do with the executive branch. I have to tell you, I'm, passionate about, the failure of OSHA to protect workers during this COVID crisis. It's fucking criminal. And, I'm gonna, as a side hobby, I'm gonna do everything I can to, push that they appoint someone to OSHA and revitalize that agency, which, my union fought for in 1970 to create, to, make safe jobs a right in this country. So, there's a lot that you can do there, but it doesn't change the balance of power. It doesn't change the dynamics. And so, look, we lost a fight with the Democratic establishment, we, the sort of whatever, broad socialist, labor-oriented left. And we did that because we didn't have enough power to beat them. So this, we got to think strategically about how you build power to take that on, and, prepare for, the fights, the immediate fights, but also, 2022 and 2024 moving forward. So, we need to be very strategic about how we move these issues. Medicare for all is a wedge issue. It's really the only effective solution to the healthcare crisis. We could maybe come together around a legislative initiative to lower the Medicare eligibility age to 60 or 55, or to cover people up to 20 or whatever, as long as it's a universal social insurance program, that's, at least a step in the right direction. But to sort of fall into the weeds around healthcare policy is not, it's not going to build any power to move us forward. So, I mean, that's sort of the big picture. We emerged from this election, we at least I hope, I mean, the jury's still out, but it doesn't look like we'll be living under a fascist regime. There'll be some space to organize, and we get relief where we can get relief. But, we've got to understand how to, both pursue our short-term instrumental interests within the Democratic Party and continue to focus on these big transformative plans that'll break us out. And that's, it's one of the problems you have with a multi-class political parties like we have in the US. It makes it extremely difficult. I happen to think ultimately we've got to find a way to break out of that structure and build an independent working class party. But, quite frankly, I don't have a blueprint about how we get from there to here, except that we have to begin to push these contradictions. And the pathway to that goes not from, working with the Biden administration. It comes from, raising the level of conflict with the Biden administration.
Thanks, Mark. I also, as a total aside, just want to plug that on Jacobin, there's a great interview that you gave about your efforts to build a labor party in the 90s that I think people should definitely check out, and is related to a lot of these questions around socialist and electoral politics. So Liv, I wanted to ask you a bit about the post-election response. And I think that it's been interesting to watch the very different, environments that have surrounded the 2016 election versus the 2020 election, which I guess shows a little bit about me, because I was very politicized by 2016. But 2016, the reaction immediately was, millions of people protesting in the streets with pink pussy hats, saying that we immediately needed to get this president out, that he was illegitimate, and that he represented a fundamental threat to democracy. And that was also kind of followed up by all kinds of things like people saying that everyone needed to purchase a newspaper subscription to protect our democracy, and also a real open encouragement of people to join membership associations that led to things like the almost overnight doubling of DSA's membership. And I think this election, Mark touched on this a bit, but the response has been a lot more hopeful, optimistic, with the primary response in the street being these like huge dance parties. And so I wonder what you think that kind of reflects about the change in the political climate from 2016 to 2020, now that Trump is gone.
Oh boy. So what does the left look like when the libs go back to brunch? I would say that I'm cautiously optimistic about not having to deal with a liberal psychosis, or at least of this Trump kind. But it's kind of impossible to say until we start organizing again in earnest under Biden in January. What I do feel okay making some sort of claim about is that I think DSA has hit the limit, like gathered the low-hanging fruit that was just waiting for a red rose organization to ask them to join. As you said, after Trump got elected in 2016, the membership doubled. Since Biden's election, like I don't have access to these numbers. I'm not that high up in the national org, but I can tell you, like, I don't think that we're going to double. So I guess what the other thing is that in the past week or so, I've been making calls to members where their dues have lapsed over the past year. Like it's been over a year since they paid dues. And the people who pick up the phone and talk to me, they are excited to like renew their dues. They're like, oh, I just forgot. Thanks for the call. So I don't think it's going to be like a ton of dropouts of at least our membership organization. But I will say, like, going back to what we've talked about this whole time, this professional, educated sector, the PMCs, if you want to call them that, that should not be our target audience, our base of membership. Like, the work that we need to do is outward facing in communities that are working class and poor. And I hope that our organization and that the left can, like, in the future going forward, looks more representative of those people, of the working class in this country. And we don't need the democracy dies in darkness crowd to join us for that to be the case.
Well said. I know I put you in a tough spot because speculating is always a recipe to eat your own words, but I think that that's a great indication of how we can expect to move forward in post-Trump America. So I want to go now to audience questions and shout out to Katie, who is helping to compile all of the questions that we're getting into questions that hopefully address everyone's comments as broadly as possible. So the first thing I'm going to start off with is looking at these kind of like party institutional questions. And panelists, just whoever would like to respond, just go for it. How can we make the case to liberals and centrists that the best way to avoid a second Trump is to put more support behind progressive policies like Medicare for all? And then relatedly, how do to our panelists, like, how do you respond to the data that suggests that moderate Dems outperformed progressive Dems?
I can start a little bit with that. I think the way you make the argument is we win a lot more races. I think that's really the only and ultimate argument. And I think we do have to realize, unfortunately, centrists with this election, they do have another lease on life. And because again, they get to say right now, they beat Trump, their strategy worked. They got a record number of votes. Now we can respond by talking about should have won the Senate, shouldn't have been that close. We can say those things, but how this is going to play out. They have that argument. But again, their situation is also, I think, tenuous depending on how this administration goes. So I really think ultimately it's about continuing to prove ourselves in the electoral realm. And I think this is something to think about the left as a whole. I think if DSA was more able to take on coordinated national action, this would be more of a reality. Unfortunately, right now, there's kind of a reaction against taking a centralized strategy, but choosing some sort of rural district that's red, and because that is the ultimate thing to prove that you all can't be Republicans, but in a rural working class district, if the left managed to start flipping those, then we're really onto something. But I think we would have to start out by maybe just picking one seat or one district and maybe throwing everything we have into that. But yeah, I think winning is the best answer always.
I don't know if anyone else wants to jump on that question before we move on. Yeah, Mark, go for it.
Well, I think Liv talked about Jane McAlevey. I think one of the key things I learned from her is understanding the difference between organizing and mobilizing. And I think that really applies to this, this idea of how do we bring, pull people together. We have to build, organizing is building a constituency, mobilizing is moving that constituency to action. And we spend too much time mobilizing and not enough time thinking strategically about how to organize. So, we need to broaden the constituency that supports, that can potentially support these kind of progressive political initiatives. And, look, we need to figure out how to confront the grip that right-wing populism has on a significant section and a growing section of the working class. And that's a reality that exists there. And we've got to figure out ways to confront that. We have to do it from the inside. I think that's the only way that works. And, do it the same way, we would deal with, building unity around any other kind of a union struggle. But that to me, that's more of a task or more of a direction toward the future than thinking that we can convince liberals and centrists to move on this stuff, because there'll always be liberals and centrists, and by their nature, that's not how they're going to think. They're going to look for the middle ground, a way to accommodate and appease these movements from below. So.
Yeah, I guess I'd just jump in and say I think it depends what we mean by convincing liberals and centrists, because if you mean convincing liberal and centrist politicians, then you just can't, right? Like that's not a goal that you should even have in your head. But if you mean convincing ordinary people who might support liberals and centrists right now in primaries against the left, then yeah, you can convince some of those. As Mark was just kind of alluded to, there are people who voted for Trump you can convince. A number that I'm sure everybody here is familiar with is that the $15 minimum wage resolution passed in Florida, and it won a bigger chunk of the vote than Trump did, even though Trump won. Which, so I'm sure most people who voted for Biden, but it's mathematically impossible. There wasn't a chunk of people who voted for that and Trump. And so that's the fragment of the coalition of people who voted for Trump who might be persuadable by different kind of campaign. The people, like, I think oftentimes there's this way of caricaturing the Bernie movement's position on how general election would have played out. And some leftists who maybe put it too carelessly or feeding into the caricature, that we think that there's this vast untapped pool of left-wing voters out there. And I don't think that's exactly what we were ever saying. I think that what we think is that there are lots of voters who see the appeal of things like, having healthcare and being paid more money, and that those people could, on the basis of that stuff, perhaps be convinced to support left-wing candidates. But that's very different from saying that there's a pool of people with thought out, sort of fixed left-wing preferences. Lots of people who can see the appeal of those things might vote for Trump for various reasons, not least that he was the one who talked more about economics, but lots of other reasons too. They might even find some of the unsavory things that he stands for appealing. That doesn't mean they couldn't be appealed to at a different time by a different platform. And lots of people, as has already been mentioned in the discussion, lots of people who voted for Biden in the primary see the appeal of those things. They just don't take seriously the idea that they could get them by voting for the left. Which is to say that, I mean, obviously, I mean, look, anybody who's a politician, with the exception of like 5 people, is pretty much the enemy. But I think that it's an exaggeration, but you get what I'm saying. But I think just like regular people who might vote in all sorts of ways, and you might think, oh, that person is a lib, because they typically support liberal candidates even in primaries. I think that's probably an overly simplistic view of the cocktail of things that motivate them. And that person shouldn't be written off that way, right? Like, people vote the way that they do for all sorts of reasons, including crucially the one that Paul was talking about, right? That they think that the most important reason, that Liv talked about earlier, right? The most important reason people voted for Biden in the primary is because they were under the misimpression that he was the best shot at beating Trump, even though obviously we know that even with a brutally mismanaged pandemic and an economic recession, he still only barely beat Trump. So yeah, I mean, I think Paul's right. I think ultimately the only way to win that argument with the people you can win the argument with, which is to say ordinary voters, is by actually winning in a bunch of unlikely places.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, especially I think you're totally right that there is a common misconception that the non-voting population, which we talk a lot about, is just kind of waiting for a social democratic platform to emerge. And like, at the risk of turning our Jacobin PSA into a Jane McAlevey PSA, I think it does mistake what our task is, which is that we have to organize a constituency that wants these things. It's not just out there waiting for us. And I think, not that this is something unique, but this is kind of really the focus of this discussion, is like, how do we in this new era kind of go about doing that? And so to that end, we're getting a lot of questions in the chat about Medicare for all. And people want to know kind of broadly how we should think about pushing Medicare for all forward. And I think one question that's interesting is, should socialists support and push for the public option? And I think for whoever picks up this question, there's sort of 2 components to this. Like, one, what is is there a winnable path to the public option? And 2, strategically, does it accomplish, what we're talking about of actually organizing a constituency that's going to be excited by the prospect of a public option and genuinely won over to the left through fighting for and potentially winning a public option? Yeah, Mark, go for it.
All right. Well, look, the public option is a bad policy idea for a whole bunch of reasons. It doesn't work. Its inherent contradictions will lead to its own demise if you try to institute it. It will create, if you try to turn what should be a public good into a commodified healthcare product, which is basically what you're saying in a public option. So they're now going to sell Medicare as an insurance product through a marketplace. Then you're going to deal with all of these contradictions of commodified healthcare, if you try to maintain this public option as a superior product, then people who will, the market dynamics will drive the people who need healthcare the most to buy that product, and the people who need it the least to buy the cheaper products in the market, which then create its own demise. So, there's all of these dynamics that just make it just like a bad policy idea. And then on top of that, there's the reality that, the opponents of Medicare for all will fight just as viciously to undermine the public option as they will to fight for Medicare for all. So why not fight for what you want rather than try to start the fight by bargaining against yourself from the beginning? There's an attempt in 2019 to pass a public option in Connecticut. It had broad political support, broad public support, and the health insurance industry just moved in and killed it. Spent what they had to spend to kill this issue in Connecticut. So, it's bad policy, and it embroils you in the same kind of fights that you would be embroiled with in the fights for Medicare for all, with very little possibility for outcome. And quite frankly, it's pretty hard, to get people to sort of, the wonkier the proposal is, the harder it is to build a broad movement that understands it and supports it. So I think it's a real dead end. I wouldn't want to run around campaigning against it, but I just don't think that it's an issue worth fighting for. And you always hear that, the stronger the movement for Medicare for all grows, the more you hear about these non-struggle solutions. Why don't we just do this? And maybe the medical industrial complex won't know that we're secretly trying to, expropriate the biggest, most profitable industry in the history of capitalism through these sneaky little policy proposals. It's not the way it is. I mean, we got, these people have to be moved out of the way.
No
Yeah.
shortcuts.
Yeah, exactly. I guess I'd also say that, like, one of the things about the phrase "the public option" is it's just incredibly ambiguous. We all sort of feel like we know what that means, but the more you dig into it, the less clear that it is. The way that centrists will describe it, on their campaign websites, especially in debates with progressives in primaries, makes it sort of sound like it would almost be Medicare for all, but without the ban on selling replicative health insurance. But then often when they're better worked out proposals, it just means like somewhat expanded Medicaid buy-in or something like that. And I think that ambiguity really allows the possibility of passing something that would suck much more than we know, and claiming it as a victory. So I think we should certainly avoid like giving any credence to the phrase "the public option" or talking about it. I mean, in the unlikely event that there was a serious attempt, to actually implement it, of course, I mean, so like anything that gives 10 more people, public health insurance, I'm for, I guess. But I think that we should really worry about, like, even rhetorically retreating from talking about Medicare for all to talk about a public option, because of that ambiguity, because of what Mark is talking about, that you're still accepting the basic framework of health insurance as something that's being sold. And because really what you're talking about is, if you, in any system, right, even the best versions of a public option, if you still have the private health insurance industry existing, then at best, you're still talking about a two-tiered system of healthcare, where there's public healthcare for poor people, and there's private healthcare for middle class and rich people, and the private healthcare can generally afford to pay out more. And if the public option tried to keep up, then that would actually destroy a lot of the cost saving benefits that public healthcare is supposed to have. And you would also have what you have right now with Medicaid, which is that tons of doctors won't accept it because they make more money from the private health providers. So I think that I think it's a terrible idea, but I guess in the fantasy where the Biden administration actually expended some political capital trying to make some version of it happening, sure. I mean, I think you have to support anything in the moment that gives more people health insurance. But when we're talking about what we want, I certainly don't think we should retreat from talking about Medicare for all, which, by the way, lest we forget, is incredibly popular, to talking about this kind of vague, wonky public option.
So I want to, for our last question, shift gears and talk about DSA. So there's been a lot of discussion about Medicare for All tonight, because it is one of the most popular programs that we support. Does the focus on Medicare for All that we have talked about for strategic reasons mean that DSA is putting the Green New Deal on the back burner? And I think the spirit of the question is like, what should DSA's national legislative priorities be as we move forward? And I think Ben in his last response has kind of pointed out that to some extent we're going to have to be flexible based on what it actually is that Biden and the Dems are proposing, that there's definitely policies that we are more or less supportive of. But I think generally the question is like, what do we want to kind of lead with to continue the task of organizing people into the left?
I can start with this one. So the thing about Medicare for All and the way that it's been framed by DSA and NNU and the other organizations that are working on it that makes it so attractive is that there are these 5 principles that are supposed to be the non-negotiables. And when something doesn't meet the 5 principles, we know that it's not really Medicare for All. Now, with the Green New Deal, which you started the question with, it's a little harder to come up with principles that could apply across the board and try to make a Green New Deal act at the national level. How I have conceived of the Green New Deal for a while now is that it makes more sense to push for local campaigns that address strategic parts of pro-worker environmental campaigns. So for example, in Philly, we have we have a campaign to try to make the city bus routes more effective. There's more to it than that. But the idea with the Green New Deal, as I've seen it, is these local initiatives that can be built out and help us form relationships with the relevant unions, whether that's the transit workers, the building trades, the teachers, if this is a green schools initiative as well. So I think there's room for priorities to live in different spaces, like national, the ones that are taken forward at the national level and we're pressuring House of Representatives versus the ones that are at the local level. And we are having meetings with building trades and city councilors. So that's how I think about the different priorities.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, to start, I mean, the whole premise, the question is that we should have priorities. And in 2017 at the DSA convention, we adopted 5 national priorities. That practice was ended in the 2019 convention. So we didn't have kind of like certain priorities. And I think that is a mistake. Clearly, there are 40 million things wrong with capitalism and 40 million worthy campaigns, but we do have to think about strategic priorities. We just can't do everything at once. And just on a Green New Deal point, I mean, I've actually seen no indication nationally or locally that Green New Deal has been put on the back burner. Again, I just haven't seen that. And like I mentioned before, in Philly, we've actually been initiating meetings with leaders from the building trades. Again, our goal is to create a plan for green renovation of our public schools that would create thousands of jobs across the states. But in terms of how we determine priorities, I mean, again, let's zoom out and think about, what are we trying to do here in general? We're trying to form the broadest coalition of working people possible, in transformative reform. So I think what our priorities are needs to flow from that. What is going to put us in touch with the broadest base of people? What is going to have the most meaningful impact? And I think we should think in terms of some lower hanging fruit stuff that is kind of just baseline more popular. Medicare for All fits that, but I think even Green New Deal, I think it plays out different in different areas, and I think it depends how it's framed. But all those kind of things, I think Bernie was a good litmus test in that, he put these ideas out there and people went crazy for them despite losing, and there's the whole story about he lost the primary, but in those states still people like Medicare for All. So it shows us, we're on the right track. And those priorities should reflect, again, what is the base we're trying to build. And I'll just add one more thing in here. And I don't think most people on the left think this, but I saw a comment on some Facebook event Philly DSA had, a phone bank for Medicare for All, and someone typed a comment like, that has majority support already. Why are we still campaigning on it? We need to move on to something else. And that's a terrible mindset because, of course, the whole point is not, do people agree with us? Now we're at the stage of how do we build enough power to, to implement it someday, hopefully, maybe in my lifetime. And this kind of relates, Liv mentioned this earlier about flitting from one thing to the next. We do need to focus. We need priorities. Again, we're literally trying to challenge the most powerful capitalist elite ever. So it might take a while to get some of these things accomplished. But I do, like, just speaking broadly, the DSA nationally and chapters should have a practice of establishing maybe 3 to 5 priorities, which doesn't mean, you can never attend a protest that's not about those, but I think priorities need to be a standard practice in our organization.
Yeah.
Oh, no, go for it.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, I think that should be. And I think that the fact that it's popular is exactly why we need to talk all the time about Medicare for All, because it's at the sweet spot of what we want, what, like, sort of big, broad, transformative social democratic agenda items and things that and things that have that widespread popularity. I mean, if we were just going to sit here and think about in the abstract about what we'd like if we had power, then hey, let's not even talk about Medicare for All. Let's talk about a national health service. But I think because it is already very popular, I think that's a reason to really emphasize it. I mean, why wouldn't you, under those circumstances, try to build support for your politics? And I think it's worth thinking about the fact that that the innate worthiness of the cause is not really the main issue, because we don't actually hold political power right now. The question is not like, what's the like, what should we be doing in our first 100 days of the Bernie administration or whatever. The question is, how do we build support for our politics? And I think that focusing on things that already resonate with large groups of people makes a lot of sense to me. And I mean, I do tend to talk about the Green New Deal as the sort of go-to things, Medicare for All, Green New Deal. Although I also even wonder about that branding. I mean, I don't know, maybe this is a lost cause, but I think that a different emphasis might actually be useful at this point, given some of the ways that the right especially has tried to counter Green New Deal talk with a lot of people. I mean, I think I think maybe like green jobs for all or something like that, might get the idea across more effectively.
Thanks, Ben. Mark, do you want a last word on priorities for the left?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can't be mechanistic about this, and these are issues that are out there. You shouldn't run away from them. Somebody, where is this question? Should socialists who want Medicare for All not talk about socialism if they want it to pass? You're socialists, so you should, you can't hide that. It's who you are. So, you don't have to be a socialist to support Medicare for All, but, this is an opportunity to engage with real working people on issues of concern. And, maybe some folks will learn about socialism and support a much, more strategic view of how you advance workers' interests as a result of your engagement with them. So, I mean, don't be assholes. This is, an opportunity to, explain to people, your worldview as you're organizing. And, that's the amazing thing about organizing and struggle, and, you get these folks who, live in these little igloos isolated from each other. And suddenly, you're out on a picket line or you're in a big fight for your life. And, people do all these amazing changes, and they're so open to, talking about things, and they so understand why the unity is so important. So, let's look for those moments and look for opportunities to reach people. And, don't be mechanistic about the issues. I do think Medicare for All is a real entry point to talking to people about a much broader range of issues. But, you can't, pretend if you're organizing in central Pennsylvania that you don't also support the Green New Deal, because that'll look just completely disingenuous. And, you just have to find ways to find those entry points with folks and do it. I mean, we had this, one last just anecdote, we had this vicious lockout at a BASF chemical plant in Geismar, Louisiana, that lasted for 6 years through the late 1980s. And our union built these alliances. I mean, these are oil and chemical workers, with groups like Greenpeace and stuff around this lockout. And, I can just remember these, kind of hippie people with flowers and bare feet, marching on this picket line with folks from, the Louisiana Bayou. And it was just this moment where, everything is possible and people are open to all kinds of views. And that's, that's how we have to, if you can engage people where they are, if you can show them that you're really in solidarity with them on these struggles, then you can begin to talk to them about a much broader range of interests and concerns.
Awesome. Well, I think that is an excellent note to end on. I don't know about everyone, but I feel a lot better, and definitely need to listen to more of these panels and less pundits. So before we go, I just want to plug, if you are here and you're not a DSA member and you're interested in joining, Katie has been posting the link to DSA. We encourage you to join us. We're going to be doing a ton of stuff, once all of the election madness kind of dies down. Obviously, big Medicare for All people here, but a whole range of initiatives. And if you want to learn more about what we do, what we're planning, you can check out our website, phillydsa.org, or you can attend our next general meeting, which I don't have the date for, but is sometime in December. And finally, I just want to thank everyone so much for coming, and thank you especially to our panelists. This was an excellent discussion, and have a good night, everyone.